Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 2, Darkening Tide. Chapter 11. Flood. Not all the slaves Hekan Seer had acquired over the last 2 cycles would be thrown to the Ra. 200 of the stronger ones would be kept to work his new lands in the region of the present Pernacum, and to construct his sun-tide palace there once the ruins had been cleared. 20 more would be picked for their looks and intelligence to serve in his household. He really could not stand taking his meal from a hand that was not well formed. Then there was the cluster of cooks and craftsmen who had skill as their recommendation. With these his chamberlain would deal. All the fortunate ones were branded and separated the day he arrived back in Frane's Point. The bulk of the selected workers were sent immediately to semi-prepared positions 5 miles to the east. Here they were set to deepening the fire pits or breaking up carts and furniture that would not be needed any longer. At the point, the camp was a hive of activity. Hekan seemed to be everywhere, inspecting, directing, punishing. The slaves who had participated in the abortive attempt to overthrow him were marked for the caves to be fed to the Ra. Guards were placed throughout the house, and searches conducted unexpectedly, even during the night. Everyone was under suspicion. There were no more invitations or visits. An atmosphere of dread descended over the entire place. The dullest and least discerning now knew that the time of crisis had arrived. In his tent, Hekan sat at table with his 3 most trusted subordinates. Bandar the chamberlain was there, along with 2 senior overseers. The men had good appetites, things were going well, and the master was pleased. They were in the final stages of many cycles' planning and effort. The difficult assignment entrusted to them was almost completed. The master's voice was a soft purr of satisfaction.
Tomorrow you will move the house with all the women 2 miles to the northwest, Bandar.
The chamberlain could not disguise his astonishment. This would place them right in the probable path of the fledgling swarm.
All the women, Marish?
Yes. My house has become a nest of treason. There is no true devotion left in it. It no longer pleases me.
He ripped the leg from a chicken and paused to examine it.
And make sure they are well guarded. The tent should be secure. It would be such a waste if any should escape.
Another man spoke up.
What about the remaining slaves? At this rate, there should be more than 1,600 left over.
Hekan looked a little surprised at the question.
We set them free, of course. As soon as the first swarmlings wake, we release them.
He chuckled.
If they are quick, some may actually make it back to Lysan.
The 4 laughed uproariously. Dandar refilled his cup.
And what of this Balos fellow? What would be his reward?
Hekan pursed his lips.
Well, he is a traitor, and should receive a traitor's reward.
He raised a finger.
But I have decided to be generous. He may also be set free.
More laughter flowed about the table till one of the overseers had a choking fit and had to be assisted by his companion. Haldred lifted her head from where she had been dozing on her folded arms. What was that noise she heard? Was it outside in the passage? It could not be another search party. There had been one but an hour before. She jumped at the scratching noise on the tent flap and then relaxed. It was only Cura, and not a moment too soon. Who would take her place during a search if the girl was absent? It would be days before her arm no longer showed the marks of the bruising caused by the guard's grip.
Where have you been so long?
She broke off as she saw the other's expression.
What's wrong?
Kira swallowed hard before replying.
I have terrible news.
She gripped Aldred's hands almost as a supplication to contradict her.
I have it directly from the kitchen.
The kitchen?
The girl shook her head.
The slaves who serve his food. Sometimes they listen outside.
Yes?
She swallowed again.
He plans to feed us to the Drak. All the women in his harem.
Aldred was stunned momentarily.
You are sure of this?
Yes. They will move us tomorrow to the north and west and lock us in our tents right in the path of the monsters.
Tomorrow?
Aldred turned away, trying to absorb the news. Kira raised both her hands to her mouth. She stood staring at her mistress, terror in her eyes.
What are we going to do?
Aldred replied absent-mindedly.
We'll think of something.
It was hard to believe that this could indeed be true. Ekan's favor was a fickle thing then.
Why did he keep me here? He knew there would be no time for...
Kira shrugged.
You amused him. That is why he kept any of us. But soon we shall be of no further use to him. His time here will be over, his task completed, and he will rid himself of us.
They would have to escape, of course, before the morning. But where would they run to? Any day now the hordes would swarm in the direction of Lysan, destroying everything caught in their path. How would they outrun the creatures with a young child along? There remained but the south, more than a 10-day through the Fez to a potentially hostile Juil, or the east, unfamiliar territory and cities unknown.
We will have to go east.
She had spoken her thoughts aloud. Kira looked at her doubtfully, shaking her head.
That's where Ekan will take his army. They have made large pits to fill with oils and wood. Even the slave tents will go in there. This is to keep between them and the Drak, so that the creatures do not turn on them instead of starting across the desert.
She shuddered at the thought.
The slaves they will release in the west, to lure them on and point the way.
Aldred turned away from her, the bitterness rising in her. What an opportunity had been missed. If it had not been for that miserable Balos.
It will have to be across the desert to Juil, then.
She sighed. The trip would be a struggle for survival, and they would arrive penniless, if at all. Ligerium would be lost. All the region would disappear into the darkness of Malik's revenge. What kind of life would there be left for them to live? The cup rolled unevenly across the stone floor, bleeding its contents as far as it went. The force with which it had been flung against the wall had caused a dent in it, warping the roundness of the rim. Fengor looked at the wounded cup as if it had gotten off lightly. He was still shaking with the rage that had prompted his action. It was difficult to speak.
I will have his head for this.
He choked out the words.
The traitorous scum! I am his king, his sovereign.
His voice rose insanely.
If I get my hands on him...
Talon stood idly by, waiting as usual for the storm to blow over. One of this intensity normally did not last. It was the brooding despondency with which he found it difficult to cope.
Gilreth is mine! Mine! I will eradicate this entire house. Nothing will remain.
Talon glanced at the king. He had turned red in the face and was breathing heavily. It would not be long now.
But his treason will be to no avail. I will break Turik without him. There will be time afterwards to deal with a good count.
The thought seemed to calm him a little, for he grew silent, stewing over the planned retribution. This was a good sign. At least he was thinking rationally again. Talon ventured a comment.
That is sound thinking. Gilreth will not make a move against you. All he can do is defy your commands and fortify himself. We do not need him at the muster. In fact, he is giving us the excuse we lacked before. No one can blame you for acting against him now.
Fengor's gasping slowed. His mouth relaxed into a line.
You are right, Quester Talon. There's no reason to be perturbed like this. If he will not come to Store, we will go and root him out in his own nest. The garrisons of Ingerval and Gerdel are on their way. Turik will not have sufficient men to stop us. Not with Melbourne in the south to contend with.
The king rang a small silver bell on the table. The door opened almost immediately, and the captain entered. He glanced nervously from one to the other. The shouting had to have been overheard in the passage outside.
Sire. Is Lucane with the army?
Yes, sire.
Fetch him here.
The man nodded and retired. Talon used the opportunity to send for more wine and fresh cups. Lucane arrived at the same time as the servant bearing them. Fingor waited for the man to pour the wine and exit the room before addressing his son.
What is our state of readiness?
Lucane sat down on the hand-rest of a chair and sipped his wine. He turned his eyes towards the ceiling.
We have 1,200 men from Ingerval, 2 days' march from here, with another 1,000 arriving from Gerdel tomorrow. Assembled in store, we have the Count's 1,400 and the 2,000 from Belruth, excluding the guard. By the first day of the Darkening, we should have almost 6,000 ready, 2,000 Nurians and 4,000 hillmen.
What of the fortresses?
Lucane seemed a little uncomfortable.
Ingerval is almost defenseless. There is a small militia guarding the gatehouse, and a few men to patrol the walls. Gerdel has 50 new recruits. Belruth is manned by the young guardsmen and a number of auxiliaries brought in from Tew and Monostor.
And the pass? Who is watching that?
The garrison is still in Lundvir, and a few men in Keras.
Fingor looked uncertainly at Talon.
If Aaron should attack us now...
Lucane spoke forcefully.
They will regret it. The garrison in Keras will not be overrun so easily, and we can always buy off Old Turek and turn this assembled force north. Any attacking army would be annihilated. Besides, there is enough snow in the pass still to turn even a raid into a risky business. We should settle Ligurium before any sizable army could get through.
Talon nodded in agreement.
Our men in the pass would give us ample warning. We would be able to reach Belruth from here before any Aranite host can besiege it.
Fingor leaned back in his chair, apparently satisfied.
6,000 men. With Byron's 2,500, it would have been an irresistible force. That fool Turek might just get it into his head to resist us.
Lucane smiled.
That would be a pity, since we plan to use his legions elsewhere. Are they not supposed to be our vanguard in Aran? Our armies would be forced to take the losses.
He emptied his cup.
This is a most excellent wine. I must remember to pay old Guira a compliment.
The new king of Ligurium was not idle. In a surge of energy born from desperation, he sent his captains throughout the realm, pressing men from tiny hamlets to the large towns into service. They threatened and cajoled, making promises impossible to keep, but a steady stream of recruits from all over trickled in the direction of Pernacum. They were untrained for the most part and ill-equipped, but that mattered little. Turek was convinced that if Fingor saw a force larger than his own assembled on the Darkweed River, he would rethink his position. It was quite possible that the crown would remain his, with the blessing of his northern neighbor. Whatever the Nurian king required of his ally would then be paid for and not merely taken. The core of his forces, the part that would be worth something on the field of battle, still lingered in the Nimona area. He had time till the first day of Genesis, when Fingor's ultimatum expired. To have his men ready and rested in Pernacum, he would have to march them there by the second or third day of the Darkening. Velia's mantle was already close to casting a veil around the morning sun. He would have to deal with the rebels later. Aldred's heartbeat was hammering in her throat again. Where were the days of lounging in the soft afternoon sun, surrounded by the soothing aroma of flowers in bloom? She remembered the laughter of her boy riding on Mara's shoulders, their tall shadow passing in and out of the bright pools of golden sunlight across the courtyard floor in Ambrose. But there would be no more such days, never again. Finally, her trembling fingers secured the fastening on Arid's cloak. She kissed him quickly and drew the hood over his head. The straps of his little pack, carrying no more than a change of clothes, were tight. Poor little boy, she thought, the son of a governor and the grandson of a king, who now looked like a bandit's brat, about to be cast out on the desert sand to flee for his worthless life. Cura stood ready at the door. She was dressed in her darkest garments, veiled and girdled, in something resembling the loose trousers of an islander, looking like some strange desert man about to embark on his first adventure without a notion of how to prepare. 4 heavy water skins lay at her feet. What provisions they had been able to acquire would be carried with their clothes in backpacks. They were as ready as they ever would be. There was a knock on the frame outside. Arid started at the sound, his eyes growing large. Cura and Haldred stared at each other in disbelief. No, it could not be possible. Tense moments passed, but there was no angry demand that they open up, no clamor of rough soldiers' voices outside. Instead, an urgent whisper reached their ears. Cura had the flap open almost instantly and drew inside a filthy figure, reeking of the caves and covered with green powder.
Maris, how?
He grinned, appearing a little embarrassed, and brought a hand up to his face.
Water, please.
Of course.
They did not mind giving him one of their precious water skins. As he gulped down the contents greedily, he looked them over. Cura quickly explained why they were in such a state of preparation. At last he lowered the skin and drew a sleeve across his mouth, leaving behind a trail of pale green grime.
I have discovered something. I think it could be of use.
He hesitated, looking at Haldred.
But if you are ready to leave...
No, go on.
I know why the Ra hate the smell of the powder. It is poisonous to them, at least while they are changing in the pools.
He related what he had witnessed in the cave. Haldred listened incredulously. A sudden surge of hope left her short of breath. Had they been offered a chance after all? Was there a possibility at last of striking a blow against the swarm? But that would mean there was no escape for them this night. Yet a place would have to be found where they could be safe. If she returned to the caves with Naris, what would become of Cura and Arid? They could not attempt to cross the desert by themselves.
How did you get out of the cave?
The same way we got in. It was no easy matter getting through the gate, though. It was a good thing I still had the hammer.
Oh no, thought Haldred, not the crawling again.
And the guards?
There are no more guards. They lashed the gate with rawhide and left. I think it is so that the creatures can get out of the cave when the time comes.
There were no more guards. A desperate scheme was taking shape in Haldred's mind.
What about the slaves? Were they just left there?
No, I saw them move the remainder out yesterday. There were only a few, perhaps 2 dozen.
The caves were abandoned. Perhaps it had become too dangerous to linger there with the monsters about to emerge from their shells, ravenous and blood-crazed. And the powder would probably not protect them against such an onslaught. To go back in was insanely risky, but it afforded them the only opportunity.
We are going into the cave.
She spoke deliberately, with more self-assurance than she felt. Cura gave a little cry and raised a hand to her mouth. Arid looked in a bewildered way from his mother to the servant girl and back. Naris alone nodded to her, smiling. This was what he had expected. Haldred would choose to act, even if there was no escape for her afterwards. She was very much like her brother had been. With trembling hands, they gathered their positions and supplies. Cura refilled the water skin. It was uncertain when they would be able to gain access to fresh water again. Maris led the way. He had a firm grip on Arid's cloak and moved the boy with him whenever he crawled from one shadow to the next. Haldred came behind, holding a tearful Cura by the hand. The poor girl was trying her utmost to be brave, but the images she had conjured of the cavern and the terror inside it were too much for her. It took all the restraint she could muster not to sob out loud. Once they were outside the city of tents, there was little fear of discovery. They walked along the pathway to where the further hilltop stood marked against the starlit sky, huddling together tightly, 4 shadows sliding across the desert. If one stumbled, there were hands ready to support. They had nothing now but one another. Haldred's own apprehension multiplied when she saw the entrance again. There was no torchlight to illuminate it this time. The darkness made it appear more forbidding than she remembered. Maris went ahead to take a look. For the 3 squatting down together in the cold, awaiting his return, he seemed to be gone a long time. Haldred was on the verge of going to search for him when she saw his figure close by, beckoning to them to move on. He made them wait in the entrance, over the cold ashes of what had been the guard's fire. When he returned, it was with a good quantity of the raw powder. Haldred lit the torch they carried. Now each one was anointed in turn, though they all reeked of it, and little Arid laughed at the soiled appearance of his meticulous mother. The sound was startling at first, as though a ritual had been interrupted, but soon, incredibly, they smiled at one another, and a little of the tight fear was dissipated. Once more Maris led the way. They passed through the gate and left it ajar, prompted by the thought of a quick escape in case flight became unavoidable. The guards had left behind a torch at the entrance, which Maris had taken down from its bracket. They kept it in reserve. It was dry and would not burn for long. The cavern was silent as the grave. Shadows retreated before the glow of their torch. Cura caught her foot on something and uttered a little cry. Haldred clasped fingers round her mouth. They froze, looking about them as if their gaze could penetrate the dark. Arid seemed concerned for the first time since they had left the tent, and sidled closer to his mother. Maris crouched down in front of them and whispered reassuringly,
It is close now. The Ra won't touch us while we are covered with this powder.
He almost told them about the 2 guards who were torn around him while he was ignored, but decided that it was perhaps the wrong thing to say at the time. Cura, for one, would not be able to appreciate the fact that he had escaped more than the horrible deaths of their pursuers. It would not surprise him if she headed screaming towards the exit tunnel. He rose to his feet and took her hand to steady her, hoping fervently that what was left of the bodies would not be in sight once they started walking again. Maris took care to show them the shallow pools round the powder platform, and where to cross without stepping in the water. Arid stared at the mirror-smooth surface in fascination as they passed. Perhaps he hoped to see something sinister. The urns were still there, waiting for them. Maris passed the torch over them. 4 were sealed, 1 half full, and 2 more overturned and empty. Either fear of the Ra had caused Akan's men to overstock the powder in great measure, or this cave was the depot for the 2 further up the valley. Surely, if they could deposit this much into the pools, it would make a difference. He spoke in the same whisper as earlier.
These are too heavy to move about. We could use the empty ones to transport smaller quantities at a time. That way we can cover the entire cave.
Haldred pried back the canvas seal on one of the urns as he spoke. She removed the lid to peer inside. It was filled to the brim with the same substance. Her pulse quickened.
We should try to spread it as evenly as we can.
She pointed to the center of the cavern.
Take Arid with you along the causeway. Cura and I will work round along the sides as far as we can.
They tilted the used urn on its side to scrape armfuls of powder into the empty ones. Haldred would not take a large amount of it at first. It was easier to return for more than to drag a heavy and unwieldy container with them over rough terrain. She lit the extra torch and set off with Cura in tow. They would take turns carrying the large urn and pause frequently to catch their breath. Stepping round the edge of the pool with care, they soon reached the cavern wall. An embankment of loose stones, some large as a cart, ran along it for about 50 yards, creating a convenient rim from which they could cast the powder into the pool. Soon, however, a narrow, broken-up ledge afforded the only access to the water. They would have to climb from one protrusion to another, balancing above the surface. With the weight of the urn to impede her, Haldred found the going extremely difficult. Perhaps it would be better if they used the causeway and had the others clamber about, but then Arid would be exposed to the risk. They would go as far as they could. Maris carried his urn in both arms, letting the boy scoop double handfuls out to sprinkle into the pool. Arid enjoyed it at first, much like a small boy would the feeding of chickens. Soon, however, it became tedious work. There was no squawking reaction or scurrying activity to encourage and amuse him, and the substance he had to dole out was unpleasant and in seeming endless supply. The youth noticed the waning enthusiasm and whispered encouragement from time to time.
I'm glad you're here. I could do very little by myself.
Arid flashed him a smile. Being useful was better than a game, at least till he became fatigued and hungry. The night was far spent by the time they had emptied the first urn. The four sat on the powder platform, eating a carefully rationed meal. They were worn out. Haldred looked from one to the other. Her boy was chewing slowly, as if he was about to doze off. Maris hung his head and ate with closed eyes. If they did not rest now, the next trip out could prove disastrous.
We will sleep here, for a few hours at least.
Kira looked up, mumbling a protest.
Here?
Haldred suddenly found the perplexed look on the girl's face extremely funny. She struggled not to laugh and possibly offend the poor creature.
It should be safe enough. The rock closest to us are dead by now, and we are so filthy that the rest might mistake us for powder urns.
Arid giggled at this, and soon they were all shaking with uncontrollable, worn-out laughter. Though it was certainly more the result of their fatigued state than real mirth, it felt better than anything had in a long time. Haldred stirred awake after what seemed just moments of forgetfulness. She glanced about her. How much time had elapsed since they curled up to sleep? A faint glow from the entrance tunnel announced that it was daytime outside. Gently she woke the others, drawing Arid's sleep-warm body into a long embrace. This was sure to have him protesting and fully awake before long.
You smell terrible.
She whispered into his hair. He mumbled in return. Smelling good was not important at this time. He wrinkled his nose.
You smell bad too.
She smiled and let him go.
Thank you. It's this new powder I'm trying out.
He laughed sleepily, and she had to reach out a hand to prevent him from slumping back down. Kira handed her half of a small loaf and a handful of dried fruit. Haldred looked in disgust at her hands covered with the green dust. They did not have spare water for washing. Was it even safe to eat things contaminated with this poison? She glanced at the stagnant pools around the platform, but decided not to touch the water inside them. Quickly she pulled off her scarf and dropped the food in it. There was enough of the stinking dust around her, on her body and in her hair, that she did not have to consume it as well. Wearily they scraped more of the dust into their empty urns. It would not do to simply battle against the mountain that remained. Haldred set goals for them to achieve. Before they stopped for a midday meal, one of the remaining 4 containers had to be empty. She paired up with Arid this time to cover the remaining distance of the causeway up to the holding cavern where the slaves had been housed. Maris and Kura worked round the side opposite to the one the woman had labored on the day before. Both parties worked with a will, almost in competition with each other, seeing who could dispense of the higher number of measures. By the time they slumped down for a rest, the urn was empty. Maris had made a curious discovery. While waiting for Kira to descend from an almost inaccessible outcrop, he had heard a faint noise coming from the shadows. When he waved the torch about a bit, an arched doorway, roughly chiseled at some point in the past to enlarge it, came into view. An oil jar stood against the wall, with several torches thrust into it. A flight of stone steps disappeared into the darkness. As soon as they had eaten, Haldred accompanied him back to the doorway. Now that they expected to see it, a clear track became visible, winding this way and that through the loose rock. They took another torch from the jar. The stairs were flat and shallow, if a little uneven. As soon as they started their descent, the sounds from below grew more distinct. They halted in consternation. A hoarse bellowing floated up towards them, wild and eerie, making their skin crawl. Haldred was ready to flee back up the steps when she remembered the cattle in the first cavern she had entered. She smiled at her companion and gestured for him to follow. Maris was still uncertain. His voice betrayed his fear.
What is it?
Cows.
He nodded his relief and started out again. Soon they could smell them. The unmistakable homely odor of cattle filled the smaller cavern they now entered. Along the sides, stretching for perhaps 50 yards, fences had been erected. Most of these pens appeared empty, but here and there animals clumped together, pressing against the lashed gates, lowing in distress. Maris and Haldred hurried through to the rear of the cavern. They were oddly nervous to pass between the pens of starving animals abandoned here, perhaps 20 in number, looking at them with panic in their large eyes. They had been left neither feed nor water, but the two somehow sensed that this was not the real reason for their unease. There had to be Ra about still, and perhaps they could sense when the creatures would rise from the pools.
There is another opening.
Maris pointed at the further end of the cavern. More steps waited for them, more weary apprehension. How far into the bowels of Myril would they have to go? A cave, perhaps as large as the first one, its ceiling lost in darkness, opened up before them. It was occupied, as the one above, by a pool over which spanned a causeway of broken rock. Not for the first time since she had arrived at Frayne's Point, Haldred fought against the hopeless tears. How far had Malik gone to ensure the utter destruction of his enemies? How many fields had one man's hatred sown with death? How many lands would bring his harvest of horror to the shores of the inland sea? It was futile, what they were doing. There was no resisting the immensity of this onslaught. She sat down and lowered her face into her hands. Next to her, Maris also collapsed onto the rocky ground. For long moments they remained thus, unmoving, silent, struggling with their despair. Maris was the first to speak.
We must find a safe place and rest properly. Then we can decide what to do.
Haldred looked round at him. The simple, steady thoughts, even when uttered with such a tone of hopelessness, restored her calm.
You are right, Maris. We have done enough for today. We will sleep in the empty cells and see what can be done tomorrow.
As soon as they saw the abandoned slave pens, they were sorry they had not gone there earlier. Many useful items had been left here by the retreating guards, who would not have considered them of any value. There was another oil jar with torches, several wooden stools, and even a low table with a couple of cracked cups on it. Inside the open cells were piles of rancid straw. In a corner stood a water barrel with 2 inches of stale water remaining in it. Haldred laughed at what they now considered treasures, but she walked from one corner to the other, with the rest, exclaiming in excitement at every new item discovered. They would be immensely more secure in this place, that was sure. The cell doors could be closed and fastened against prowlers. they would have beds immeasurably more comfortable than the powdery rock of the platform. Here they could hide against the awakening of the swarmlings. Here there was a possibility of surviving till the storm had passed. With renewed hope and vigor, they set out to bring their meager supplies into the shelter of their new home. Maris made a small fire for them from a bundle of straw and some rags that had probably belonged to the former occupants. He also found a pile of empty wine jars and a broken spear, which he promptly assigned to Arid. The boy was so absurdly pleased that they had to laugh. With iron bars to keep out the raw and the comfort of real beds, the four slept soundly. In the morning they devised a new strategy. It would be much easier now they had the wine jugs. Maris explained that each person could have his own supply of powder and a torch. Much more ground would be covered this way. When the jars were running low, Cura and Arid could go back to fetch more from the platform, while he and Haldred continued the work. One could also sift the contents of the jars directly into the water, since they were light enough for such maneuvers. A long day lay in front of them. There was growing apprehension about the hatchling of the swarmlings, and each one stole furtive glances at the surface of the water from time to time. Every time they did so, they were inspired afresh to get the powder into the pool as quickly as possible. Their labor was not only of possible benefit to the people in the path of the swarm, it was preserving their own lives as well. When they felt it was time for the midday meal, Haldred and Maris sent the other two ahead and remained to empty the jars they still had. Only one urn was left on the platform. They aimed to keep a quantity of powder to pour round their sleeping quarters, as well as allow them safe passage out of the caves again. There was no telling how many of the raw had actually dropped into the pools, and how many lurked out of sight in the dark dome of the cave. The last of the green dust disappeared into the pool. Haldred watched it go and wished there was no need to return. She had seen no proof that the powder actually killed the creatures in the water. After all the work, she was not even sure that it was doing any good. Maris came to stand at her elbow. Together they lifted their torches and moved it from side to side over the water. A few bubbles rose from the bottom to float on the surface. They waited, suddenly obsessed with finding evidence of their success. They imagined a slight slurring in the murky shallows. More bubbles rose to break on the surface.
There.
Maris pointed excitedly. Haldred saw the shape of some unrecognizable animal turn over slowly in the water. It was much larger than the raw, with spindly limbs, slimy and smooth in the liquid that had seen its spawning and its demise. Slowly she crouched down to get a closer look. The thing appeared lifeless. Another appeared next to it while she watched, even larger. She could see a shin bone and long, curved, claw-like toes. Maris took in his breath sharply next to her.
By Imran's vengeance, it's working.
Haldred nodded silently.
Let's go.
They passed through the cattle pens, the sounds of desperation tearing at their nerves. Maris halted in exasperation.
Should we not let them out?
His voice echoed in the hollow space.
Not yet. If any of Hekan's men remain, they will know something is amiss.
Could the cattle not have broken out by themselves?
Perhaps. But how would they have broken the lock at the entrance?
She raised a tired hand to push back a strand of hair that had fallen across her face.
We will wait a few more hours, till the powder is gone and we are safe in the cells.
The sight of floating corpses added an element of horror that they decided to keep hidden from Cura and Arid if possible. But it had inspired them to complete their task that day. Half of the powder they would keep for their own use, and the rest would be scattered in the bottom pool. Maris and Arid labored on the far side of the causeway. The boy was worn out and sluggish, often sprinkling the dust over stones as well as in the water. Maris stopped several times to explain to him again. Perhaps it would be better to let the child sit out and continue on his own. 60 yards away, the woman had almost circumvented the pool. They were working quickly now, having done the same thing over and over again. Powder flowed from their containers in an almost uninterrupted stream. Together they put down the empty ones. These would not be refilled. A short, difficult section remained, their final stretch. Cura smiled up at Haldred. They had picked up the last jar. It was not even full. Soon they could return to the cells, their task completed. It was a wonderful feeling. There was a cry from the direction of the others, followed by a loud splash. Haldred froze, staring at the causeway. The screaming of a child in mortal terror resounded in the close air. More shouting and splashing followed. She clutched her throat. Arid! Something had happened to her son. She shouted to Cura, and they both started making their way back to the causeway as quickly as they could. The screaming had ceased abruptly, but now there was a frightened sobbing in its place. Haldred saw the light of a torch out on the rocky bridge, and in it she could make out the figure of Maris holding her little boy. Her feet hardly seemed to touch the ground. They were both soaked to the skin. Arid was crying softly now, while Maris rocked him to and fro like a baby, whispering into his ear. Haldred was next to them.
What is it? What is wrong? Look at you.
Maris turned his face up at her without stopping.
He slipped and went into the water. He's fine, just a fright.
As if in corroboration of what he said, the boy sniffed once or twice and stopped crying. Haldred made up her mind.
It is enough now. I'm taking him back to the cells. We have done what we can.
Maris rose to his feet and released the boy. He put a hand on the wet hair.
You're fine now, little fellow.
Arid nodded and turned to his mother, who held him at arm's length.
Look at you. And you called me dirty.
A little embarrassed smile appeared on his face. Maris picked up the jar. It was still half full.
I'll put the remainder in by myself and let the cattle out.
Haldred nodded, her head spinning with tiredness.
Be careful.
She turned to go.
Wait. Better give me some of that.
She scooped powder out of the jar and poured it liberally over the wet form of the boy. At first he wanted to protest, but quickly remembered his terror of moments before. Maris made a game out of it, sprinkling a new coat of green dust over his sodden clothes as well, and ending with a crown of dirt clinging to his hair. Now he declared himself king of the cave, and gave the boy permission to be as filthy as the new sovereign was. When they reached the cells, Haldred nearly collapsed with exhaustion. She made the boy remove his wet clothes and gave him her cloak to sit in. Singling out a few oddments from their store of fuel, she decided to risk making a fire. They needed the comfort of it now, and at least the clothes would be dry sooner. Cura sat with her hands in her lap, her head bowed forward onto her chest and her eyes closed. Her hands and fingernails were grimy with green dust, her dark trousers and coat stained with powdery patches. Her hair was in a similar state, as if she had aged overnight. Perhaps we have all aged, Haldred thought. Her legs and feet ached with the incessant clambering over rocks during the past days. Her eyes burned with the odious powder and the lack of sleep. Yet she was grateful for the opportunity they had been given. The pains she now experienced were signs of their triumph. At least some of the horrors that would have torn the innocence of her land were no more. She leaned back against the straw, ignoring the crawling of whatever inhabited these cells. Oh, what she would give for a plunge into pure crystal water! She looked at her own hands and laughed, thinking suddenly of her brother.
Oh, Vengus, if you could see where your adventure has taken your poor sister.
She remembered the palace gardens in Arois and Varus, the games of hide-and-seek, the daring rescues, the robber barons. How different it was in reality. There was no excitement as they had imagined when they were children, only fear, deep, paralyzing, draining fear, and yet there had been sufficient courage to perform this one task. Would it really make a difference? There were 5 other caverns, perhaps bigger than this one. Still, there had to be many, many thousands of Drak in the pools they had poisoned. If they had but destroyed 1 in 6 of the horrible creatures, it was a considerable achievement. Such heavy losses inflicted on it at the outset might cripple the swarm and give Ligurium and Nuria a fighting chance. Maris returned and stretched out grateful hands towards the little blaze. He had brought with him a short beam scavenged from the animal pens. In the morning he would go for more, taking his hammer. He took the precaution of pouring most of their powder over the threshold of their cell. The straw still scattered in the other cells he collected and piled up outside the bars of their little fortress. If they were hard pressed, it could be set alight, perhaps hurting whatever was trying to get at them. Finally, he brought in the water barrel and lashed the gate closed. His 3 companions watched these preparations with growing unease. When he sat down among them, they made up a silent, apprehensive little group. They decided to keep one torch burning at all times. The darkness was permeated with growing menace once more. Imran's orb seemed pale and weary as it sank towards the western skyline. Helia the Wanderer had arrived to spread her train around the golden disk as the cycle descended into darkness, like all those before it. The blue was fading from the sky. A dull gray nothingness replaced it, the color of thin smoke. In ever-increasing brightness, the Wanderer crept towards the sun, a brilliant blue light in the van, the tail a huge wake in the waters of the air. Byrand looked a moment longer, though his attention was needed elsewhere. The last sunset of 598 post-summoning was slipping away over Nuria. The darkening days were upon them. He raised a hand. Commands rang out immediately, and the great courtyard below him came to attention. Proudly he surveyed the host of Gilreth. How they had toiled these past seasons. Even now they stood before him, weary to the bones, faces young and old, besmirched with sweat and dust, held high as they stared at him. What was going through their minds? He had taken them from sheepfolds and cattle pens, from potters' wheels and furnaces, stolen them from behind the plow, from the hearthside of peaceful old age, from their mother's arms. And now they stood before him, thus, transformed into the greatest host Gilreth had ever fielded. 5,000 fighting men in number, and worth many times that in skill, 200 more in attendance. He had turned them back to the forbidden art, had them exercise the abilities outlawed and suppressed for so long. Byrand's heart sang as his eyes moved from one unit to the next. In the center stood his archers, 1 veteran to 3 boys, aged between 12 and 15. The number increased in this manner from 3 to 1,200. All had seasoned air bows. The welcome consignment from Fenvale had placed fine weapons in the hands of the youngest. Around them were grouped the main force in 7 units, armed with long chrysolite-tipped spear, reinforced shield, and steel sword. Tough leather armor covered the torso, strapped round the throat and between the legs. Bracers and greaves protected their lower arms and legs. On their heads were helms of steel, covering temples, nose, and throat. They were trained to fight the swarm, able to form up in wedge-shaped formation to block a defile or narrow valley, a champion at the front of each tip, luring enemy hordes between into the killing ground. If caught in the open, they could wheel about in moments into a 7-pointed star with no weak place to be penetrated, fighting off huge numbers while completely surrounded. The spears gave them an advantage of reach, with 2 more ranks able to support the men in front. The soldiers were disciplined, reacting swiftly to commands in the field and under pressure. Their sergeants were capable, experienced men who understood the task entrusted to them. To one side stood a picked sentry in the colors of ancient Gilreth, the white stars of the Blade constellation emblazoned on their sable circles, repeated in black on the left thigh of their white hulls. Their armor was of bright steel, their shields smaller and not so heavy. They carried no weapon but the Viron blade. These were the shock troops, whose art was combat. They would break the strongest enemy formation, drive the wedge between commander and men, strike at the heart. the real sting of Gilreth's army to knock down an opponent with a single blow. Yet these were not the most potent by far. At the rear of the host, in single file, 33 men had taken up their station, his son Garulain among them. These were the champions, to fight in the front line, the tips of the wedge formations. They were grouped in threes and could fight as a unit, each man knowing the mind and manner of his companions, able to support or lead as the occasion demanded. Each man carried a blade and small spiked buckler of chrysolite. There were other groups also, men of medicine and healing, who had found their true potential through the art. 3 battle priests, one from Hera Inrath, who had remained with them, auxiliaries, cooks, helpers, in front a line of younger boys to act as runners and aides. A host prepared through the intervention of the old man Karth of the Witch Isle, and so many others besides, who sent arms and armor, instructors and advisors. The men in front of him were the hope of many nations. And now at last he could tell them the truth. Fengor's spies could report all they liked. It was too late to act now. His voice was deep and hollow in the enclosed space. Men of Gilreth, we have reached the threshold at last. In front of us now waits the days of triumph and glory, of sacrifice and valor. You and I will strike a blow for the survival of our people and the freedom from oppression for all who live around the inland sea. You have trusted me this far. You have worked and not faltered, without understanding and without reserve. I know there are questions in your hearts, and I will answer them. There are rumors that we will march against our kin in Nuria. He pointed towards the west, where 150 miles away, across the still water, Belruth lay sleeping. There are tales that Byrand has become a traitor to his king and his people, that he will not support them in war as he has promised to do, that he will rise up against Fengor and rip apart the nation. There is even talk of Byrand desiring to see his son upon the throne in Belruth. He raised both arms. Now hear the truth. You who remained loyal in spite of wicked lies. Fengor is deceived, even if he is king, and his questers are blind, even while they claim to lead the way for all. He has fallen out with his allies, and exposed his land to invasion and ruin, and the one behind it is ready to strike. Malik Yulian of Terralan is the sworn enemy of the Viran. His plotting has deprived us of the art, of our Aranite allies, of Vadran friendship, and now of Ligerian support. The hatred of that ancient runs deep. Since the forgotten ages, when his issue, the Tour, were driven into the swamps by our forefathers, and the pride of his life slain by the mighty Vir, he has worked for this time of revenge with all his tenacity and guile, slowly and secretly rebuilding his broken forces, planning his moves from the hidden places within his new realm, where he has enslaved and preserved a remnant of our people, subjecting them to all manner of cruelty and brutal ill use, sending out wave after wave of the scourge from the waste, to savage our lands and give us something to fight against. But his preparations are complete. The Shadow Lord will throw his hordes against us soon, catching Fengor and the entire eastern shore asleep. He raised his right arm. But not Gilreth! There were cheers from the men below. Byrand waited for them to die down. We are not marching against Nuria. We are not marching against Aran or Ligerium. We are marching to their aid and salvation. There were shouts and a spontaneous raising of spears, deafening and exuberant. Byrand turned away from it, his face glowing. The hooded figure behind him did not seem to share in the excitement. The Count of Gilreth paused and inclined his head before speaking. Perhaps now, after all these seasons, you will tell me your name, my lord, and how it is that you could bring us such knowledge and instruction. The man dropped back his hood, revealing a face unlined, yet no longer young, under cropped white hair. His eyes stared unblinkingly into Byran's.
You have done well here, Count. My name matters little, but since you would have it, I will oblige you. But first, there is a final instruction for you, one that is of the utmost importance.
Byran frowned. Ever since the arrival of the strange, lordly man in grey cost, his instructions had been vital to their preparation. Not only did he have extensive knowledge of the swarm, but there would never have been an awakening of potential among the people of Gilreth without him.
The host must not move out before the third 10-day of Genesis, and then only as far as the prepared positions on this side of Tew.
Byran was astonished. The third 10-day? But Fingor will need our aid before then.
Do not fail in this. If you are caught up in the chaos before Belruth, you will lose your host. By the time the swarm reaches Tew, it'll be at the end of its strength. Only then can you turn it with force of arms. And you will need every man you have for what follows after it.
Byran looked perplexed, but he nodded.
You cannot save Fingor or those who are with him. He would not be saved by you anyhow. He would rather perish. Deal with the swarm first. Then you can make your sacrifice for the Viron, like we all will.
A strange coldness had crept into the air. The Lord of Gilreth shivered with it. He realized suddenly that he was looking upon the face of the stranger for the first and last time. The man turned to go. Byran reached out a hand as if to restrain him. Your name, sir? The white head turned. Shadows of the dying day had crept over the facial features, but the eyes still appeared bright, as if they had a light of their own.
I am called Kenath, keeper of the towers in the pass to Aaron.
Byran brought up a hand to his gaping mouth. He dropped to his knees, bowing his head to the ground. 2 words escaped from his mouth. Lord Veer. Veer the seer turned away once more, a slight smile turning the corners of his mouth. Ranald of Aaron lifted his eyes from the dispatch of the messenger still waiting in front of him. The man could barely stand. He snapped his fingers at a page standing behind his chair.
Trenian, tell the captains to enter, and then take this man to the chamberlain. Let them see to his comfort.
The boy bowed low and, taking the messenger in tow, exited the room. 2 men entered in his wake. Ranald acknowledged the bows and motioned them closer.
Please take a seat. I've received vital information from Lord Karth.
He pointed to empty chairs round the map table and rose up to lean over it. Once the men were seated, he pressed a finger on a smudge on the southern coastline of Aaron.
The main assault will be made on the beaches just east of Sunderend as we expected. The gap is narrow there, and the crossing relatively easy and safe. They could put 10,000 warriors over in a day.
He paused and looked at each of the men in turn.
The temptation is great to meet them on the shore and press them hard before they can organize themselves. I've been advised against such an action, however.
He raised a hand at their protestations.
The warriors of Goramul thrive under chaotic conditions, for one. It will not be a great disadvantage for them to be assaulted before they can organize their formations. But that is not the most important consideration.
He placed a finger on Karth's isle.
The barbarians will first overrun Heron Inrath with the major part of their forces. From there they will coordinate their attack with the crossing at Sunderend, landing a larger army north of Kiel behind us.
He traced his finger across the sea to the shore of Aaron.
We shall be committed against the invaders in the south, and be cut off from the fortress at Greenmere, and more importantly at Aaron Rock. No reinforcement would be able to fight their way through to us from the north. We would not be able to get our wounded to a place of safety either. Fighting them on the shore while they outnumber us 10-1 is a death trap. And do not forget our rebellious subjects in the mounds, waiting in our rear for any sign of weakness. There may very well be an uprising of sorts to support the invasion in the south.
Evrain, frowning, spoke up at last.
What do you propose then? Where shall we attempt to stop them?
Ranald thrust his finger down on the map like the tip of a sword.
At the rock. I will lead them there myself, fighting a rearguard action all the way from Greenmere, as if we have been caught by surprise.
Railf interrupted.
We will leave the city undefended. No, a garrison will remain there under a trustworthy commander. They will have to hold out for a 10-day at most. Meanwhile, you, Captain Railf, will hold the rock till I arrive.
What? I will be left out of the fighting. Ranald smiled at the eagerness of his commander.
Not at all. There's where our informants come in.
He tapped the letter.
2,000 warriors will attempt to surprise the capital just before the main assault of the invasion forces from the south and east. If they can overpower the men holding the rock, we will be in deep trouble. This first attempt must be repulsed, yet it should seem that we are still in the dark about their plans. Our full force will be concentrated around Danemere to the north, where we will lie in wait. When the enemy host unites around the rock and bring their full weight to bear, I will lead the army to the rescue, trapping the barbarians between Iron Rock and the Black River. If they have sustained heavy losses in their attempt to breach the defenses, we can destroy them utterly.
There was silence as the captains considered this. Evrain sat with his chin in his hand, a puzzled expression on his face.
Where do you want me to be in all of this? With you and the main host?
Ranald regarded him steadily, a little frown creasing his brow for the first time.
No, Evrain. I have another use for you. It may be a bit dangerous.
Evrain shrugged.
You mean there are tasks to perform that are safe?
Ranald laughed nervously.
Fair enough. But it will be the more challenging task, though there are no simple or easy roles for a soldier right now. I am placing you in command of our war fleet.
Evrain stared. This was a surprising development.
That is dangerous?
It could well become dangerous. You will have to make quick decisions in waters that could easily become your grave. Your first assignment will be to watch the Witch Isle. Lord Karth has won the allegiance of the Sea Ravens to harass the invasion barges of the barbarian host, and to evacuate his army once the position becomes untenable. But the Track Islanders are notoriously untrustworthy. In my opinion, it is not certain whose side they will take in this conflict. Lord Karth may well find his people stranded, and at the mercy of the enemy horde. You begin to see the danger now? We cannot take on the Sea Raven fleet in combat. Therefore, you cannot risk getting involved in the action around the Witch Isle without being certain of the islanders' allegiance. Furthermore, even if the Sea Ravens merely look on and do nothing, which is a strong possibility, your ships may be overwhelmed if you approach too closely to the barbarian boats. If the wind is too light, they may catch up to you with paddles and board. The soldiers of Heron Inrath will be a most welcome addition to our army. I believe we can win without them, but it will be a hard struggle. Bring these people to our shores.
Evrain considered the matter carefully.
I will do my best, but if I empty the warships of soldiers to act as transports, we will be almost defenseless. I recommend we bring in a fleet of large fishing vessels to perform that duty. They are quick if the wind is fresh. Our warships can act as escorts.
Ranald seemed pleased.
Do as you think best. I leave the details to you.
And after I have secured the Inrathians?
You will do what you can from the sea to support our efforts at the rock. If the enemy boats can be destroyed, they will never succeed in taking the fortress. But I fear that will be a task well beyond our capabilities. I merely expect you to cause as much damage as you can, without losing your ships in the process.
The king smiled at his captains.
This is a war such as we could never have imagined. The little raids and skirmishes in the past pale in comparison.
Even Railf had to smile now. In all the long cycles of his duty as commander, he had never seen a full-scale war. Ranald touched his neatly trimmed beard with a long-fingered hand. He appeared quite satisfied. It was time for a little refreshment.
I believe we have concluded our discussion. Is there anything we have not mentioned?
Railf was staring at the map. His gaze settled on the Witch Isle.
I still do not trust this sorcerer.
Ranald hid a smile behind his hand.
Captain Railf, We will soon see for ourselves whether he is trustworthy or not. The intelligence is very specific.
The captain would not be convinced without expressing his doubts first.
Of what use is a sorcerer in a war like this?
Ranald spoke slowly as to a stubborn child.
Would you face a beast such as was described here not so long ago by Prince Rune?
The big man hesitated.
If such a thing exists, no, I would not.
In a war where we are faced with dragons, would it not be wise to have a sorcerer or two on our side?
Ralph shrugged defiantly.
Perhaps.
Javia of Shirvan, regent of Fenvale, woke with a start. A figure was standing in front of her bed. She was alarmed at first and opened her mouth to summon the guard, but she remembered other similar occasions. Javia threw back the covers and swung her feet to the floor. The boy stood stock still, facing her, his eyes firmly shut. She took hold of his shoulders and gently shook him awake. Once he seemed to be aware of his surroundings, she spoke softly into his ear.
What is it, Peric? Have you come to tell me something?
He reached up and put his arms around her neck. His voice was still heavy with sleep, but she could make out every word clearly.
When the prince man comes, you must let him have guilt, for he will need to hurry. Tell him I want the boy to have my bow, the one you are keeping for my naming day, and the arrows too.
Immediately, the little body went limp in her arms. The boy's breathing was deep and regular. Javia held him for a moment, then lifted him onto the bed. She would get the guard to take him back to his room. Looking down at him fondly, she nodded her head.
I will do as you ask, my boy, even if this man knows nothing of horses, and guilt cannot be tamed, and even if the boy you mention is already beyond our reach or aid.
The regents gave the dreaded order in the morning. All the lands of Fenvale from the sea to the borders of Lysanne would be flooded. The briny water would reclaim fields. Many cycles of hard work had lifted out of the marshes as crop-yielding farmland. The livestock would be driven to hilly islands. Houses and small towns would disappear. The people, their labor and livelihood now lost, would brave the cold of early Genesis in tents on the outskirts of Shirvan, Doyle, and Chendis, the only settlements of size to remain above the water. It broke her heart to do it. Javia sat for a long time in silence, staring at her hands, after the signed proclamation had gone out. She knew there was no other way if they were to survive Malik's latest onslaught. Fenvale would have to sacrifice its prosperity. They could build again once the storm was past, if it would ever pass. The country of the southern Vadran would soon be an extension of the inland sea as it had once been. The rugged shoreline, breached in places by the rushing water, would remain, an isolated bastion with the land behind it already taken. Mountains and hills would become islands of green in the swirling morass. Only the causeway would remain to link the capital with the other towns in the southern mountain passes. It was high and narrow, allowing passage for only one cart at a time. With wooden bridges every few miles that could be easily destroyed, no swarm could make its way across in sufficient numbers to become irresistible. Any invading force would also be delayed and harassed almost indefinitely, having no way to be deployed for battle. Javia felt a tight apprehension close in on her. The evil days had descended upon them. Could she not have done more? Could Fingor and his advisor not have been persuaded? She sighed heavily. There were too many cycles of bitter accusation and scorn, too much antagonism and open persecution to wipe away. Nuria was doomed, and all who would oppose Malik with it. Grek was bristling with spears. A nervous energy had taken hold of the citizenry and military alike, though no one could find an explanation for it. Workers toiled long hours on digging pits and throwing up earthworks to bolster the weaker places along the wall. Others brought in supplies from farmsteads far afield, not pausing for rest once their cargoes had been stored. Craftsmen labored every day, till the light failed, to erect wooden platforms for the newly fashioned engines of war. Ox carts moved in and out of the city gate, groaning under the weight of stone to be broken for the walls. The militia practiced incessantly with bow and spear. Experts from the Nurian contingent, brought back from their encampment outside Nicoma, coached and trained them till there was a basic proficiency. Crowds of urchins gathered around them, sometimes imitating the sweating men with crooked spears of their own making. From his perch on top of the guard tower, Melvor looked on impassively. Sometimes he took a hand in the training, often he inspected the work on the walls or pits, but mostly he stood watching the mad scrambling of the little ants below. If the potential onslaught would be as massive as Haldred's youthful messenger had described, their best efforts would make little difference now. It was too little, too late, with no effective authority in Lysan to take control. Every decision he made, every improvement or training exercise he wanted carried out, had to be strong-armed through the city council, for still he could not bring himself to warn them of the possible danger. Not that he doubted it himself, but they most certainly would laugh him to scorn. The task of preparing against the swarm would grind to a halt. The weak and infirm, the old, the women and children, would not be evacuated. Where would they go anyhow? To Ligerium? This was not an enemy to strike at the combatants or king alone, and afterwards subject and rule over the people. And Breck was far from being a fortress. It was a city, ill-prepared and vulnerable. The merchant was often at his side now, supplying what he needed without mentioning payment or price. At least Asar knew the threat they faced was all too real, and that urgency was required if they were to face it at all. Asar stood with him in the tower on the first morning of the darkening. For once he had little to say. They looked on dejectedly as the murky light of the false dawn spread in the east. Pelia had her former lover and lord once more in a close embrace. This day the stars would not fade, and the golden warmth of Imran's orb would not spread over the hills and houses. Never before had this sight touched Melvor as it did now. He had seen much combat, and had learned to trust his instincts. Often he had felt the approach of danger before it could be perceived by the senses. As he regarded the ghostly bluish cloud that covered the sun, the prickles of premonition rose to a silent scream inside him. For the first time since that impossible day, when he had stood before the Truth Council and looked into the eyes of his condemned son, Melvor felt raw fear. A wind was driving in from the direction of the desert. In the farmyards and hovels, the slumbering streets of hamlets and towns, dreadful apprehension stirred. Animals strained against tethers, nervous, restive. For 2 days wild things had been spotted, fleeing past the outskirts of town in broad daylight. Birds were moving to the west, in ones and twos, in dozens and scores. One could almost suspect a great fire was moving in their direction. The light of Myril was turned out once more. On the walls and sturdy houses of stone, banners fluttered in the growing murk. A hush settled over the marketplace. The early hagglers and criers of wares looked towards the east and trembled. Above the keening wind rose the crying of a baby. A troubled mother closed the shutters. Children, newly woken, huddled close to the hearth, subdued and silent. Old people stopped their chewing and forgot to complain. They rose tottering from their chairs to look at the darkening sky and out across the rooftops of their lost youth, now sinking into night at the end of the cycle. Somehow a feeling of despair took hold. The darkness had closed in like so many times before, but now there seemed to be no promise of a distant dawn. Trembling, they turned away to look for the comfort of a fire and the proximity of other living things. A clamor stood up from the desert, as of 1,000 wings beating together. the flooding of a mighty sea, to drown the known world and all its people. A snarling tide had risen, like the sand driven before the high wind, uncontrollable and irresistible, falling on all things living or dead, an appetite insatiable to leave behind a wilderness of ravished earth. It spread around the barren hills of the wasted lands, over the ground where the tent city had stood, milling madly over the days-old smell of prey. The larger, stronger ones took up the trail to where the canvas flap torn in desperation, and struggling groups had fled into the whirlpool of dust. Others followed in packs and hordes, streaming westwards after the promise of nourishment. Quickly flowed the tide now, away from the pools that gave them birth, a raging tumult to engulf the tents of Hecan's abandoned house, the fleeing slaves beyond, the towns and fields of Lysan. They heard the noise, the thunder of it, down in their cell. Above the howling wind, the echoes of the swarm reached into the caverns from wall to wall, rippling the still waters of the pools. Now the great terror was upon them, and they clung to one another. The flame of their single torch, dancing in a trembling hand, cast its light over their gaping mouths, their wild, staring eyes. Could it be that all the horror would pass them by, and not steal down into their hiding place, to look on their distress and tear their bodies as the first sacrifice at Malik's feast of death? Maris propped his back against the wall of the cell. He gritted his teeth and struggled against the overwhelming panic. Over and over he assured himself that the creatures in their cave were all dead. He tried to remember the lower cavern, the causeway, and the pool. Had there been a cave even further down that they had missed? Were the spindly creatures swarming up even now, lured by the smell of fresh meat? He gripped the broken spear, testing the tip against his thumb. Even if he had been a trained fighter, there was little one could do with such a poor weapon. Slowly, methodically, he rubbed the dents out of the metal blade on the smooth stone. There was little to do but wait.